In the quiet suburb of Cedar Ridge, the Mitchells' perfect life masked a dark secret. Behind their charming home on Maple Street, something sinister was brewing, ready to shatter Susan Mitchell's world. What seemed idyllic was about to unravel, revealing a nightmare of betrayal and hidden danger. To their neighbors, the Mitchells were the perfect family. Susan was the epitome of a devoted wife and mother, her days filled with the routines of suburban life: cooking, attending PTA meetings, and spending time with friends. Mark was a successful businessman, often away on work trips, but always returning home with gifts and stories that painted him as the ideal husband. Together they seemed to embody the American dream. But behind the smiles, something was amiss. The Mitchells' marriage, which had once been a source of pride and joy, had become a facade, hiding a growing chasm between them. Susan had noticed subtle changes in Mark over the years. His increasing absences, the way his eyes seemed to glaze over during conversations, the coldness that had crept into their once warm relationship. She had pushed these thoughts aside, convincing herself that they were just the result of stress and time. After all, every marriage had its ups and downs. Then, one fateful afternoon, everything changed. Susan was cleaning out the attic when she stumbled upon a small, unmarked box tucked away in a corner, hidden beneath old photo albums and Christmas decorations. Curious, she opened it, expecting to find forgotten keepsakes. What she found instead would shatter her world. The box contained documents, letters, and photographs that told a story Susan could hardly believe. There were pictures of Mark with another woman, their smiles and embraces captured in moments of intimacy that left no room for doubt. There were letters filled with words of love and promises, written in Mark's handwriting but addressed to someone else. Susan's hands trembled as she sifted through the evidence. Her heart pounded with a mix of shock, anger, and disbelief. How long had this been going on? How could she have been so blind? As the realization sank in, Susan felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Her husband, the man she had loved and trusted for so many years, had been living a double life. The betrayal was almost too much to bear, but Susan knew she had to confront him. She couldn't continue living a lie, pretending everything was fine when her entire world had just crumbled around her. That evening, when Mark returned home from work, Susan was waiting for him in the living room. The box sat on the coffee table, its contents spread out for him to see. The look on her face left no room for pretense. She knew everything. Mark's initial reaction was one of shock, but it quickly shifted to a cold, calculating expression as he realized the gravity of the situation. Susan demanded answers, her voice trembling with hurt and anger. But Mark's responses were vague, filled with half-truths and evasions. As the confrontation escalated, Mark admitted that the affair had been going on for years, that he had another life with another woman, a life that had been carefully hidden from Susan and everyone else. But even as he confessed, there was something in his demeanor that unsettled Susan. He wasn't just a man caught in a lie. He was a man calculating his next move, trying to figure out how to control the situation. The argument ended with Mark storming out of the house, leaving Susan alone with her thoughts and the painful reality of her shattered marriage. As she sat there, surrounded by the remnants of her husband's deceit, Susan knew that this was just the beginning. She had uncovered a secret, but she had no idea just how deep it went, or the danger that it would soon bring into her life. In the days that followed, Susan found herself engulfed in a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sadness, confusion, and a growing sense of fear. The perfect life she had believed in was nothing but a mirage, and every glance at Mark brought a fresh wave of pain. His cold demeanor only added to her suspicion that there was more to his secret life than he had let on. Mark became increasingly distant, spending more time away from home, and when he was around, his behavior was colder and more detached than ever. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, had turned into a stranger. His once warm eyes now held a chilling indifference, and his smiles were replaced with a thin, tight-lipped expression that made her skin crawl. Determined to uncover the full extent of his deceit, Susan began her own investigation. She went through his belongings, searched his office, and even checked his financial records. What she found only deepened her sense of betrayal. There were bank statements showing large withdrawals of cash, credit card charges for expensive hotels and restaurants, and more letters and emails exchanged between Mark and his lover. Each discovery was like a dagger to her heart. But Susan pressed on, driven by a need to know the truth. Her search led her to an even darker discovery. One evening, while going through Mark's desk in his home office, Susan came across something that made her blood run cold. A set of keys she had never seen before, along with an address scribbled on a piece of paper. The address wasn't local. It was in a city several hours away, a place Mark had never mentioned. The discovery sent a chill down her spine, and Susan realized that this could be the key to uncovering the full extent of Mark's secret life. Without telling anyone, Susan decided to visit the address. She needed to know what else her husband was hiding, even if it meant facing more painful truths. On a Saturday morning, while Mark was away on another one of his mysterious trips, Susan set out on the long drive, her mind racing with thoughts of what she might find. The address led her to a small, nondescript apartment building in a quiet neighborhood. The place looked ordinary enough, but as Susan approached the door marked with the number from the paper, she felt a sense of dread wash over her. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorknob, before she finally unlocked the door and stepped inside. What she found inside the apartment was a nightmare. The walls were adorned with photographs of Mark and his lover, their lives together laid out in plain sight. There were clothes in the closet, personal belongings scattered around, and a faint scent of perfume in the air. But what caught Susan's attention the most was a small, locked cabinet in the corner of the room. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, she searched for a way to open it. It took some effort, but she finally managed to pry it open. Inside the cabinet was a collection of items that made Susan's heart stop. Documents, passports, and various IDs, all with different names and faces, but bearing Mark's photograph. There were also stacks of cash, weapons, and what looked like plans or blueprints for something sinister. Susan realized in that moment that her husband was not just a cheating spouse. He was living a double life as someone completely different, involved in activities far darker than she could have ever imagined. Terrified and overwhelmed, Susan backed away from the cabinet, her mind reeling from the implications of what she had just discovered. The man she had married, the father of her child, was not who she thought he was. And now she had uncovered something that could put her own life in danger. She needed to get out of there. But as she turned to leave, she heard the sound of footsteps approaching the door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized that whoever was coming was about to find her in a place she was never meant to be. Susan's heart raced as the footsteps grew louder, each step echoing her mounting terror. She quickly scanned the room for a place to hide, her mind scrambling for a way out of this nightmare. The only option was the closet, where she had seen the clothes and belongings of Mark's secret life. With no time to waste, she darted into the closet and pulled the door shut, just as the front door began to creak open. Through a small gap in the closet door, Susan watched in horror as a tall, unfamiliar man entered the apartment. He was dressed in a dark suit, his face cold and stern, carrying an air of authority that sent a shiver down her spine. This wasn't Mark, but someone else entirely. Someone who clearly knew about this place and had access to it. The man moved with a purpose, heading straight for the cabinet that Susan had just pried open. As he reached inside and began rifling through the contents, Susan held her breath, praying he wouldn't notice anything out of place. The man pulled out a stack of documents and began leafing through them, his expression unreadable. He muttered something under his breath, words that Susan couldn't quite make out, but the tone was enough to tell her that whatever was in those documents, it wasn't good. After a few tense moments, the man returned the papers to the cabinet, locked it, and made a quick call on his phone, speaking in a language Susan didn't understand. The conversation was brief, and when he hung up, he seemed satisfied, as if everything was in order. He left the apartment as swiftly as he had entered, leaving Susan trembling in the closet. She waited until she was sure he was gone, before emerging from her hiding place, her legs weak and shaky. The close call had rattled her to her core, but it had also made one thing abundantly clear. She was in way over her head. Whatever Mark was involved in, it was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined, and now she was at risk simply because she had dared to uncover his secrets. In a daze, Susan left the apartment, locking the door behind her and hurriedly making her way back to her car. As she drove away, her mind raced with thoughts of what she had seen. The fake identities, the weapons, the large sums of cash. Mark wasn't just a cheating husband. He was involved in something criminal, something that could destroy not just their marriage but their lives. And if the man she had just seen knew about her, then she was in grave danger. By the time Susan returned to Cedar Ridge, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. She parked her car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, trying to gather her thoughts. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. But who could she trust? The police? A friend? Every option seemed fraught with risk, but doing nothing was not an option. She needed to act, but carefully, and without alerting Mark. As she entered the house, she was greeted by the familiar warmth of home, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of Emily's laughter upstairs. For a brief moment, she considered pretending nothing had happened, trying to resume her normal life. But the weight of what she had uncovered made that impossible. This was no longer just about a broken marriage. It was about survival. Determined to protect herself and her daughter, Susan decided to start documenting everything she had discovered. She wrote down what she had found, the address of the apartment, and details about the mysterious man she had seen. She took photos of the documents with her phone, carefully hiding the evidence in a place where only she could find it. She even considered contacting a lawyer. But without concrete proof of the danger she was in, she wasn't sure what help they could offer. As the night wore on, Susan sat at the kitchen table, her mind racing with plans and contingencies. She was exhausted but too afraid to sleep. Every noise outside made her jump. Every creak of the house made her heart skip a beat. She was living in fear, trapped in a situation that was spiraling out of control. And the worst part was she knew Mark would be home soon, home to a wife who now knew too much. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and fear for Susan. She went about her daily routine, but everything felt different, darker, more dangerous. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that Mark or someone else knew about her visit to the apartment. The tension between her and Mark grew unbearable. He was colder than ever, and his late-night absences became more frequent. Each time he left the house, Susan felt a mixture of relief and dread, knowing that his return could bring something far worse. One evening, when Mark returned home, Susan knew she couldn't keep quiet any longer. The secrets, the lies, the constant fear, it was eating away at her, and she needed answers. She needed to know what her husband had become, what kind of man could live such a duplicitous life. As soon as he walked through the door, she confronted him. "Mark, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She stood in the doorway of the living room, blocking his path, determined not to let him brush her off this time. Mark paused, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her. There was no warmth in his gaze, no love, just cold calculation. "What is it, Susan? I've had a long day." "Don't lie to me anymore, Mark," she snapped, her voice gaining strength. "I know about the apartment, about the other woman, about everything. You've been living a lie, and I'm done pretending I don't see it." For a moment, Mark didn't respond. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile curled on his lips. A smile that sent a chill down Susan's spine. "So you finally figured it out," he said, his voice low and mocking. "I was wondering when you'd put the pieces together." Susan's heart pounded in her chest. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. There was no denial, no attempt to explain, just cold acceptance of the truth she had uncovered. "Why, Mark? Why would you do this to us? To me? To Emily? Why?" Mark repeated, his smile fading as his expression darkened. "Because you were never supposed to find out. I had everything under control until you started poking around where you shouldn't have." Susan felt a wave of anger and fear wash over her. "And what was I supposed to do? Just sit back and let you ruin our lives? Let you destroy everything we've built?" "You don't understand, Susan," Mark said, his voice now icy. "This isn't just about an affair. It's about survival. You've put yourself in danger by getting involved, and now I have to clean up the mess." The threat in his words was unmistakable, and Susan realized with horror that Mark was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. She took a step back, her mind racing for a way out. "You don't have to do this, Mark. We can still—" "Still what?" Mark interrupted, his tone sharp. "Still pretend everything's fine? Still act like we're the perfect family? That ship has sailed, Susan. You should have left it alone." The room seemed to close in on her as the gravity of the situation hit her full force. This was no longer just a confrontation between a husband and wife. It was a life or death moment. She needed to get out, to protect herself and Emily. But Mark was already moving towards her, his intentions clear. "Susan, I'm sorry it's come to this," Mark said, his voice almost regretful. "But you've left me no choice." Susan's breath caught in her throat as she backed away, her heart racing with terror. She could see the resolve in Mark's eyes, the cold determination to silence her once and for all. But before he could take another step, there was a loud knock at the door, startling them both. Mark froze, his eyes darting towards the door, then back to Susan. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the tension thick in the air. The knock came again, more insistent this time, and Mark's expression hardened. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low and threatening. "And don't do anything stupid." He turned and walked towards the door, leaving Susan trembling in the living room. She knew this was her chance, perhaps her only chance to escape. But she also knew that whoever was at the door could be in just as much danger as she was. She had to think fast to find a way to warn them without alerting Mark. As the door creaked open, Susan strained to hear the conversation between Mark and the unexpected visitor. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat echoing in her ears. She knew that whoever was at the door could be her only chance at survival. But she also feared that Mark might manipulate the situation to his advantage. "Mr. Mitchell?" The visitor's voice called out, firm but polite. "Yes?" Mark responded, his tone now carefully controlled, masking the tension that had filled the house just moments before. "I'm Detective Lewis with the Cedar Ridge Police Department. We've been conducting a routine check in the neighborhood and noticed some unusual activity in the area. I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." Susan's breath caught in her throat. A detective, this could be her lifeline, but she also knew that Mark was skilled at deception. If he sensed any danger, he would find a way to divert suspicion. She needed to act quickly, but without giving herself away. "Of course, Detective," Mark said smoothly. "Please come in. I'd be happy to help in any way I can." Susan heard the door close and the muffled sound of footsteps as the detective entered the house. Every nerve in her body was on edge as she carefully stepped closer to the doorway, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening. She needed to signal to the detective without alerting Mark. But how? As she peeked around the corner, she saw Mark and Detective Lewis standing in the hallway. The detective was tall and broad-shouldered, his expression serious but calm. Mark, on the other hand, wore a mask of concern, but Susan could see the cold calculation in his eyes. He was already trying to assess the situation, looking for any sign that Susan might betray him. "We've had a few reports of suspicious activity in the area," Detective Lewis said, his eyes scanning the room. "Some break-ins, people noticing strangers loitering around. I just wanted to make sure everything's all right here." "Everything's fine," Mark replied smoothly. "My wife and I haven't noticed anything unusual. But we appreciate you checking in. It's good to know the police are keeping an eye on things." Susan's mind raced. She needed to do something, anything, to signal that she was in danger. She glanced around the room, looking for something she could use. Her eyes fell on the coffee table, where she had left her phone earlier. It was within arm's reach, and she knew that if she could just send a quick message, the detective might notice. As Mark and the detective continued their conversation, Susan slowly reached out, her fingers trembling as she grabbed the phone. She kept her movements subtle, trying not to attract attention. With her heart in her throat, she typed out a single word. Asterisk, asterisk, help asterisk, asterisk. But as she went to hit send, Mark's voice suddenly cut through the air. "Susan, honey, could you come here for a moment?" Susan froze, her thumb hovering over the send button. She looked up to see Mark staring directly at her, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. He must have sensed her unease, and now he was testing her, seeing if she would play along with his charade. Forcing a smile, Susan slipped the phone into her pocket and stepped into the hallway. "Yes, dear?" Mark's smile was thin, his gaze never leaving hers. "Detective Lewis is just checking in on the neighborhood. I was telling him how safe and quiet it usually is around here." Susan nodded, her mind racing for a way to communicate her distress. "Yes, it's a very peaceful neighborhood," she said, her voice trembling slightly. She hoped the detective would pick up on the fear in her tone, but she had to be careful not to overplay her hand. The detective looked at Susan, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if sensing that something was off. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice gentle but probing. Susan's heart pounded in her chest. This was her chance. She needed to say something, anything, that would tip him off without Mark realizing what she was doing. She opened her mouth to speak, But before she could respond, Mark interrupted. "She's just a bit shaken," Mark said smoothly, wrapping an arm around Susan's shoulders. "We had a small scare earlier when we thought we heard someone outside, but it turned out to be nothing. She's just a little on edge." Susan felt the blood drain from her face as Mark tightened his grip on her shoulder, a silent warning not to say anything more. She forced a smile, trying to keep her composure. "Yes, just a little jumpy," she said weakly, praying that the detective would see through the act. Detective Lewis studied them both for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I understand," he said finally, though his eyes lingered on Susan, as if trying to read the truth in her gaze. "If you notice anything unusual, don't hesitate to call the station. We're here to help." "Thank you, Detective," Mark said, his voice polite but firm. "We'll do that." Susan watched helplessly as the detective gave a nod and turned to leave. Her heart sank as she realized that her chance at escape was slipping away. But just as the detective reached the door, he paused, glancing back at her. "Ma'am, take care," he said, his voice carrying a subtle weight that made Susan's pulse quicken. He was giving her a final opportunity, a lifeline that she needed to grasp before it was too late. But before she could respond, Mark spoke again, his tone sharp. "Good night, Detective." With a final searching look at Susan, Detective Lewis left, closing the door behind him. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room escalated to unbearable levels. Mark released Susan, stepping back to appraise her with a chilling calmness that made her skin crawl. "That was a close call," he said quietly, his eyes boring into hers. "You almost made a very big mistake, Susan." Susan felt a wave of cold fear wash over her. Mark knew, he had seen the desperation in her eyes, the silent plea she had tried to convey. And now she was more vulnerable than ever. The atmosphere in the house changed drastically after the detective left. Mark's mask of civility had slipped, revealing the true menace lurking beneath. He didn't need to say anything. His cold, calculating gaze told Susan everything she needed to know. She was trapped, and any attempt to escape would only provoke him further. For the rest of the evening, Mark barely spoke to Susan, but his presence was suffocating. He watched her every move, his eyes following her like a predator stalking its prey. Susan knew she needed to be careful. Any misstep could be her last. The fear that had been gnawing at her for days now consumed her entirely, leaving her numb and paralyzed. As the night wore on, Susan tried to come up with a plan. She couldn't just sit back and wait for Mark to decide her fate. She needed to find a way to protect herself and her daughter. But how? With Mark's sharp instincts and constant surveillance, any attempt to reach out for help could end in disaster. By the time Emily came home from a friend's house, the tension in the air was palpable. Susan tried to act normal, but Emily sensed that something was wrong. She glanced between her parents, her brow furrowed in concern. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked quietly, her eyes filled with worry. Susan forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a little tired." Emily didn't seem convinced, but she didn't press further. Instead, she went upstairs to her room, leaving Susan alone with Mark once more. The silence between them was deafening, and Susan felt like she was teetering on the edge of a precipice, with no idea how to pull herself back. Later that night, after Emily had gone to bed, Susan heard Mark moving around in his study. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she quietly approached the door, pressing her ear against it to listen. She could hear the faint sound of papers rustling and the soft click of a lighter. Her heart raced as she realized he was destroying evidence, trying to erase any trace of his double life before she could expose him. But as she listened, she also heard something else. Mark's voice, low and tense, as he made a phone call. She couldn't make out every word, but the snippets she caught sent chills down her spine. "Took care of it. No loose ends. She doesn't know the whole story yet, but she's close. Yes, tomorrow night." Susan's blood ran cold. Tomorrow night, what did that mean? Was Mark planning to make his move then, to eliminate her once and for all? The thought of what he might be planning made her stomach churn with fear. She couldn't wait any longer. She needed to act, and she needed to do it now. As quietly as she could, Susan backed away from the door and headed upstairs. She needed to gather what little evidence she had and make a run for it before Mark could stop her. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. Mark was standing there, his eyes locked onto hers as if he had been expecting her all along. "Going somewhere, Susan?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. Susan's heart pounded in her chest as she forced herself to stay calm. I was just checking on Emily. Mark stepped closer, his gaze never wavering. You're lying. The words were like a dagger, cutting through the thin veneer of composure she had been clinging to. She felt the weight of his suspicion, the threat lurking beneath his cold stare. He knew she had been eavesdropping, and he wasn't going to let her get away with it. Before she could respond, Mark grabbed her arm, his grip tight and unyielding. You've been snooping around where you don't belong, Susan, and now you're going to regret it. Panic surged through her as she realized how dire the situation had become. She tried to pull away, but Mark's hold was too strong. She was trapped, with no way out and no one to turn to. The only thing she could do now was fight. Fight for her life, for her daughter, for whatever shred of hope she had left. But as Mark dragged her into the bedroom, Susan knew that this was a battle she might not survive. The darkness was closing in, and she was running out of time. Susan's heart raced as Mark dragged her into the bedroom, his grip like a vice around her arm. She struggled, trying to break free, but he was too strong. The fear that had been gnawing at her for days now exploded into full-blown terror. She knew she was out of options, but she also knew that she couldn't give up, not when Emily's safety was at stake. "Mark, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this. We can find another way. Think of Emily. What will this do to her?" Mark hesitated for a brief moment, his grip loosening just slightly. For a split second, Susan thought she might have reached him, that some part of the man she had once loved was still in there. But then his eyes hardened again, and the moment was gone. "This isn't about Emily," he said coldly. "It's about survival. You shouldn't have gone digging where you didn't belong, Susan. Now you've left me no choice." Susan's mind raced, searching for a way out. She knew she had to act fast before Mark could carry out whatever plan he had in mind. Summoning every ounce of strength, she lunged forward, catching him off guard. Her sudden movement caused him to lose his balance, and she managed to break free, rushing toward the bedroom door. But before she could reach it, Mark recovered and grabbed her by the wrist, yanking her back with brutal force. Susan screamed, hoping against hope that Emily would hear and come to her aid. But she knew that her daughter was asleep in her room, blissfully unaware of the danger that lurked just down the hall. Mark's face twisted with rage as he forced her onto the bed, his hands tightening around her throat. Susan gasped for air, her vision blurring as she fought desperately to free herself. She could feel her strength waning, the darkness closing in. But she refused to give up. With the last of her energy, she reached out and grabbed the bedside lamp, swinging it with all her might. The lamp struck Mark across the head with a sickening thud. He let out a grunt of pain, his grip loosening as he staggered back, stunned by the blow. Seizing the opportunity, Susan scrambled off the bed and bolted for the door, adrenaline pumping through her veins. She raced down the hallway, her only thought to get to Emily and escape. As she reached her daughter's room, she flung the door open and shook Emily awake. "Emily, get up! We have to go, now!" Emily, groggy and confused, quickly sensed the urgency in her mother's voice. She didn't ask questions, just nodded and followed Susan as they fled down the stairs. Behind them, Susan could hear Mark regaining his senses, his footsteps heavy and fast as he gave chase. They burst out the front door and into the night, the cool air hitting Susan like a shock. She looked around frantically for help, but the street was eerily quiet. In a panic, she and Emily ran toward the car parked in the driveway, praying they could reach it in time. But as they fumbled with the keys, Mark appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of fury. Susan knew they wouldn't make it if they didn't act quickly. With trembling hands, she shoved Emily into the car and jumped into the driver's seat, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life just as Mark reached the car, pounding on the window with his fists. Susan floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as they sped down the street, leaving Mark standing in the driveway, his shouts echoing in the night. Tears streamed down Susan's face as she drove, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and relief. They were safe for now, but she knew this wasn't over. Mark would come after them, and they couldn't run forever. But as she glanced over at Emily, who was huddled in the passenger seat, she knew that she would do whatever it took to protect her daughter, even if it meant facing Mark one last time. As the darkened streets of Cedar Ridge flashed by, Susan made a silent vow. She would stop running. She would find a way to end this nightmare, to ensure that Mark could never hurt them again. and she would make sure that the secrets he had tried so hard to keep buried would finally see the light of day. The fight wasn't over, but Susan was ready. For Emily, for herself, and for the life they deserved, she would win.